The chosen one, a dead one, is watching you. You feel it, don't you? Those invisible eyes, that silent presence, that energy you can't explain, but you know deeply. Because you don't walk alone in this world. You don't fight alone. A spirit, a watcher, a protector is always with you. Silent, but powerful. Distant, but always close. This is not a coincidence. There is someone watching you, protecting you, knowing your high destiny. Moments in your life that you cannot make sense of. Inspirations that come for no reason. Invisible hands holding you, just when you are falling. None of these are random. They have not left you, because you are not an ordinary person. In this video, we will talk about who is the hidden power watching over you, why it is still with you, and how this divine connection will change your path. Are you ready? Write 77 in the comments right now, because the unseen world is watching you. They assumed they could probe into realms beyond their reach, that they could unravel your fate without consequence. They mistook the unseen for something passive, something that could be deciphered at their convenience. But they were wrong. The moment they attempted to trespass into your spiritual path, they learned the truth. You are not someone to be observed from the shadows. You are the force that steps into the unknown, uninvited, unshaken, unchallenged. Your energy didn't just disrupt their inquiry, it shattered the illusion of their control. The hands that once manipulated unseen forces trembled, and the breath that carried their questions caught in fear. No one pries into what is sacred without awakening the presence of its guardian. And now they understand that all too well. The room where the reading took place had no idea what was about to unfold. The dim glow of a desk lamp illuminated the tools of the trade, cards laid across a well-worn cloth, incense curling in slow spirals toward the ceiling. It was a familiar setup for the one performing the reading, a process repeated countless times before. But something in the air was different, charged, waiting. The client, eager but wary, placed a photograph on the table. Your image stared back at the reader, a silent challenge wrapped in stillness. "I need to know everything about this person," the client said, their voice laced with a need that went beyond curiosity. It was obsession, hunger disguised as a simple request. The reader hesitated. Her instincts recoiled before her mind could intervene. The weight of the photograph in her hands was heavier than it should have been. There was a whisper, low but insistent, pushing against the edges of her awareness. A warning, but she ignored it. The price offered was far too good to refuse. The cards shuffled between her fingers, moving in practiced motions, until the first card fell onto the table, and reality itself seemed to shift. An unnatural cold gripped the space. The temperature plummeted without explanation. The smoke that had gently floated toward the ceiling suddenly held still, then contorted in violent, impossible patterns. The reader's breath stilled. The hair along her arms stood upright, her body responding to something primal before her mind could catch up. The energy in the room had changed. "He's here," she whispered, unaware she had spoken. The client's expression flickered between confusion and unease. "Who's here?" The question hung in the air, but the answer was already evident. The boundaries between what was known and what lay beyond had been erased. The veil between worlds had not thinned. It had been torn open entirely. The light cast by the candles twisted erratically, their flames bending in response to something unseen. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, moving of their own accord. The protective stones lining the reader's shelves vibrated violently, their usual presence of stability rendered useless in the face of what had entered. The room, once a sanctuary, no longer belonged to her. This was no fleeting spirit, no lingering remnant of energy waiting to be deciphered. This was something else, something conscious, something aware. You had arrived. Your presence was not a fleeting specter in need of guidance. It was a force, an undeniable, all-consuming force. This wasn't the passive energy of a soul being observed. This was will. This was absolute authority. The reader felt it in her bones. Decades of experience in the metaphysical meant nothing in the face of what now occupied her space. She was no longer the observer. She was the one being watched, and she was not alone. If you feel the abundance of divine love in your heart, now is the time to share it. You can help spread God's blessings by clicking the Super Thank You button on YouTube and contributing $20 or more. This divine gift will touch not only your life, but the souls of many through this platform. Each of you has a sacred place in God's grand design, and your generosity will be the fruit of our prayers. Act now. Share your blessings to glorify His kingdom, for you were created to do even greater things in God's loving hands. May God bless you. The client, who had spent months searching for answers, who had exhausted every known avenue to gain insight into your path, suddenly found themselves in the very position they never anticipated: exposed, vulnerable. The carefully orchestrated attempt to pry into your future had flipped in an instant. This was not their reading anymore. This was judgment. There had been signs from the beginning. Psychics refusing to take on the request. Readers backing out after initially agreeing. Hesitation, avoidance, unexplained cancellations. The client should have known. But obsession is blind. They had convinced themselves that there were no barriers strong enough to keep them from the knowledge they sought. That if they pushed hard enough, spent enough, sought the right people, they could bypass the unseen protections that surrounded you. What they failed to understand was that you are not someone who can be accessed at will. You are not a page in a book to be turned, not a story to be read without consent. They had not hired someone to peer into your secrets. They had unknowingly issued an invitation, and you had accepted. The client leaned forward, trying to reclaim the authority they had assumed they possessed. "Why is it so cold in here?" they asked, a fragile attempt at maintaining control. Is something wrong? The reader, her hands frozen above the cards, did not look at them. Her gaze was fixed on the swirling, spiraling energy above your photograph. "You didn't tell me who this person really is," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Because this was no ordinary reading. The cards had resisted the moment she touched them. The room's energy had shifted the second your name was spoken. The tools she relied on had failed her. The instincts she had spent years honing had given her only one answer: do not proceed. But she had ignored it, and now she was paying the price. The first card drawn had sealed her fate. It wasn't merely a prediction. It was a consequence. The balance of spiritual law had been disrupted, and the response had been immediate. Your presence had rewritten the rules of engagement, had turned what was meant to be an exposure of your future into an unveiling of their own weaknesses. The realization dawned too late. The reading was not for them to observe you. It was for you to see them. The one who had sought to uncover your vulnerabilities now sat in the very seat they had prepared for you, laid bare, seen in full clarity, every secret, every motive, every intention exposed. The arrogance that had fueled their persistence dissolved into something far more primal: fear. They had come looking for your weaknesses, and instead, they had revealed their own. This was not about revenge. It was not about interference. It was about balance, about consequences, about the unshakable truth that some people do not operate within the rules others assume govern the world. Some destinies are protected. Some souls answer to higher forces. Some people are simply untouchable. By the time they understood what had happened, it was too late. The client fled, their carefully constructed plan crumbling into nothing. The reader sat in the silence of what remained, her hands still trembling, her spirit still reeling from what she had witnessed. The energy that had consumed the room slowly withdrew, but it did not disappear. It left something behind, a mark, a presence that could not be erased, could not be cleansed away. For those who walk unguarded into forces beyond their understanding, there is always a cost. And for those who seek control over what was never theirs to wield, there is always a reckoning. No one touches what is sacred without awakening the force that protects it. And now, they would never forget it. They had no idea what they were truly doing. They assumed they were gathering information from a safe distance, that they could pry into something sacred without setting off alarms. But what they didn't realize was that their actions were not passive. They weren't merely looking into the unknown. They had unknowingly extended an invitation. A door had been opened, not to secrets, not to glimpses of an unseen path, but to something alive, something aware. They assumed they were the observers, the ones in control. But the moment they stepped over that threshold, they found themselves the ones being watched. The client leaned in, oblivious to the magnitude of their mistake. "Why is it so cold all of a sudden? What's going on?" Their voice held a forced confidence, an attempt to mask the creeping unease that was beginning to take hold. The reader, however, had no such illusions. Her gaze remained fixed, unblinking, locked on the air above the photograph. The swirling patterns of incense smoke no longer moved with the natural flow of the room. They were shifting with intent, forming spirals too precise to be coincidence. "You never told me who this person truly is," the reader whispered, her voice barely audible over the tension that now thickened the space. Every warning sign had been there from the beginning. The deck had felt heavier than usual, each shuffle requiring more effort. The pendulum on the shelf, still and silent for hours, had begun swinging wildly the moment the photograph touched the table. Her spirit guides, normally vibrant, ever present, had withdrawn, their absence a glaring alarm in the silence. She should have known better. The tension built before the first card was ever drawn, like the pressure in the air before a storm. It wasn't just instinct, it was something tangible, a resistance pressing back against her actions. Stop. The message was clear, not in words, but in feeling, in an unshakable knowing that what she was about to do was wrong. She did it anyway. It was like striking a match in a room filled with unseen gas. The moment her fingers touched that first card, the moment she dared to turn it over, the entire atmosphere changed. The shift was not gradual, not subtle. It was instant, undeniable, all-consuming. The warmth was yanked from the air as if the very breath of the room had been stolen. The walls themselves seemed to pull away, stretching like something alive, bending at impossible angles. The candle flames, once steady, snapped into wild, erratic spirals, their light no longer bound by natural law. The shadows they cast did not obey the objects around them. They moved of their own accord, shifting unnaturally, creeping into spaces they had no reason to exist in. She felt it deep in her bones, the mistake, the transgression. This was no ordinary reading. She had opened something that was never meant to be touched. The air pressed in around her, thick and humming, with an energy that had not been there before. It was the kind of pressure that made ears pop and stomachs turn, the same sensation of standing beneath storm clouds heavy with lightning. But this was not a storm of the natural world. This was something else, something far older and far less forgiving. Her breath hitched, her pulse spiked. The deck of cards in front of her, which had always been a tool of control, of insight, of quiet power, now felt like a broken radio receiving a transmission too strong, too clear, too overwhelming. The first card had barely landed on the velvet, and yet the room was no longer hers. The moment had already been claimed by something greater. She wanted to step back, to distance herself from the very reading she had initiated, but there was no place to go. The walls were still there, the floor still beneath her, but they no longer felt solid. It was as if she had been pulled into a space between spaces, a threshold that had been forced open, revealing the presence of something she was never meant to witness. And that's when she understood. She had not simply turned over a card. She had called something forward, something awake, something aware. The realization struck her like a slap, and for the first time in her years of practice, she understood what it meant to be in the presence of something that did not need her interpretation, that did not require her guidance. Dear brothers and sisters, may God's peace be upon you today. I am here to remind you of a profound truth. Our existence is grounded in God's divine plan, unshaken by the temporal concerns of the world. As the Bible says, whatever is done in faith will return to God in abundant blessing. Luke 6:38. Like that great oak tree, our roots are deeply rooted in God's universal truth. Every step we take, every stand we take, is secured by His strength. And now you are being offered the opportunity to be part of that blessing. When you use the Super Thank You button and donate $100, this movement will return to you 100-fold in abundance. This was not a passing energy, not a lost soul wandering too close. This was authority. This was ownership. The power in the room did not wait for her to name it. It had already claimed its own space, already made itself known. She had not summoned anything. She had intruded. And now she was face to face with the consequence. The smoke in the room, which had once drifted lazily from the incense, was no longer acting as it should. It twisted against the laws of nature, spiraling violently toward the center of the table, coiling around the card she had drawn like a viper, tightening its grip. Her body went rigid. She could barely hear the client behind her anymore, barely register their presence. It didn't matter. Nothing in this room was about them anymore. A bead of sweat slipped down the side of her face, chilling as soon as it left her skin. Her fingers twitched, aching to gather the cards and stop the reading before it could go any further. But she already knew the truth. It was too late. The moment she flipped that card, the moment she crossed that threshold, she had sealed herself into this moment. There was no escaping it. She had reached beyond what was hers to touch, and now she was being watched. This was no longer just a reading. This was a mistake unraveling in real time. The space that had once been hers no longer belonged to her. Something fundamental had changed. It was not the presence of a lingering energy, not a soft whisper from beyond. It was something fully present, fully aware, something claiming back the ground that had been trespassed upon. The reader gasped, clutching the edge of the table as a presence, foreign yet undeniable, pressed in against her mind. This was not an entity waiting to be interpreted. This was not a lost soul looking for guidance. This was an arrival. There was no transition, no gradual thinning of the veil. There was only absence and then presence. The client, oblivious to the full extent of what was happening, tried to regain control of the situation. "What's going on? Say something." Their voice was shrill, cracking under the weight of their own fear. The reader didn't answer. She couldn't. Her hands trembled. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps. 20 years of spiritual practice rendered useless in an instant. The cards scattered across the table, flipping in all directions. The tower landed directly at the client's feet. A warning, a judgment, a consequence. Another card had fallen face down over the photograph, as if placed there intentionally. When the reader turned it over, the image of judgment stared back at her. The meaning was clear. This was no ordinary interference. This was a reckoning. The client's confidence collapsed entirely. Their eyes darted around the room, looking for something, anything visible that could explain the growing terror that was clawing its way through them. Their arrogance, their sense of superiority had shattered, leaving behind only the raw, unfiltered truth. They had come looking for power over something they did not understand. Instead, they had made themselves vulnerable to it. The fear was no longer just emotional. It was primal. They scrambled to their feet. I think we should stop. I don't want to know anymore." Their words spilled out in a desperate attempt to undo what had already been set in motion. But it was too late. The reading was no longer about them extracting information. It was about them being exposed. The reader's mind had been cracked open under the weight of the experience. Her once strong intuition now drowned beneath the magnitude of what she had touched. She had ignored every sign, every instinct, every whisper of warning. And now, the cost of that arrogance was clear. The client fled without looking back, their carefully constructed plan abandoned in panic. They had paid for answers, but all they had gained was fear. The reader remained, sitting in the wreckage of what had once been her safe space, but it no longer felt like hers. Her hands still shook, long after the energy in the room had settled. The days that followed were a slow unraveling. Readings failed. The cards refused to speak. Predictions came up empty. Clients noticed. Bookings vanished. Her once unshakable confidence in her practice had been fractured at its very foundation. Her spirit guides, the ones she had relied on for years, remained distant. And every time she closed her eyes, she felt it. The moment it all changed. The presence that had entered not as a guest, but as a force, reclaiming its own. Some violations can be corrected. Some spiritual errors can be undone. But some trespasses leave a mark that cannot be erased. She had crossed a boundary she never should have touched, and now she carried the weight of that mistake. What the client and the reader had never understood was that there are some fates that do not bend to curiosity, some souls that do not bow to interference, and some energies that do not merely observe, they respond. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Some actions ripple through the unseen, triggering consequences that cannot be undone. The one who sought knowledge of you, who attempted to manipulate fate in their favor, was blind to the magnitude of their mistake. They believed they were gaining an advantage, securing insight that would place them ahead. Instead, they stumbled into the very force they were trying to outmaneuver. The reading was never about uncovering your secrets. It was about revealing their own downfall. The moment they interfered, the balance of the unseen world began to correct itself. What was meant to be hidden remained untouched. What was never theirs to claim was stripped from them entirely. The signs of disruption appeared quickly. Plans unraveled. Opportunities vanished. The stability they had built on deception crumbled beneath them. What had once flowed easily in their favor now resisted them at every turn. It wasn't misfortune. It wasn't coincidence. It was the weight of their own actions pressing back against them, demanding restitution. What they failed to understand was that some people are not just protected, they are untouchable. Those who walk under divine alignment are not bound by the rules that govern ordinary lives. Their path is written with authority beyond human comprehension, shielded by forces that do not waver. To interfere with them is to defy something greater, something that does not allow injustice to go unanswered. The one who sought power over you was met not with the advantage they craved, but with a reckoning they never expected. Each setback, each moment of loss, bore the same energy they had encountered in that room. It wasn't anger, it wasn't revenge, it was simply correction, the restoration of order, the collection of a debt they didn't realize they had accrued. They tried to convince themselves it was all just an unfortunate turn of events. But deep down, they knew. They had reached for something forbidden, and the universe had answered. They turned to others for help, seeking out new guides, new paths, hoping to undo what had already been set in motion. But the response was always the same: avoidance, refusal, warnings spoken in hushed tones. Those who once welcomed them into spiritual circles now kept their distance. Every attempt to cleanse what had attached to them failed. No ritual, no offering, no desperate plea could erase the mark they now carried. It was not a curse, but a reminder, a signature imprinted into their energy, visible to any who could truly see. They had walked too close to something they did not understand, and now they could not escape its gaze. The reader, too, found herself changed. Her once steady hands shook even in ordinary moments. The trust she had in her own intuition, once her greatest strength, had been shattered. The spirits she once called upon no longer answered. Her once reliable insights became muddled, fragmented, slipping through her grasp like sand. What she had built over decades of practice had come undone in an instant, and deep within, she knew why. She had crossed a line that should never have been touched. Some violations demand payment, some transgressions demand acknowledgement. This was not an act of destruction, but of restoration. The world does not allow sacred paths to be disturbed without response. Those who interfere with forces beyond their comprehension do not walk away untouched. Now is the time to share God's blessings by clicking the super thank you button on YouTube. You can contribute to His plan and be a part of this divine mission with a donation of $100 or more. Every gift reflects God's generosity, and I believe it will return to you exponentially far beyond your expectations. Remember, His protection and blessing is on your every step and every donation. You become part of His divine plan. You are a strong, radiant being, unshakable as His mighty rock. Witness God's miracles, feel the fruits of your generosity in your soul, and illuminate the world with confidence and courage. Be blessed and let the light of the Lord guide your path. You, however, remained unmoved. Perhaps you never even noticed the battle that had been fought in your name. Perhaps you only felt a shift, a moment of clarity, an unshakable sense of peace, the absence of an unseen weight. While they wrestled with the consequences of their choices, you continued forward, untouched, unbothered, shielded by forces that have always been in place for you. There are those who move through the world as ordinary travelers, following roads paved by others. And then there are those whose steps carve new paths, whose mere presence commands the space they inhabit. You are not one to be studied, not one to be pulled into the games of lesser minds. You are not someone to be read like an open book. You are the force that rewrites the story. No one reaches for what is yours without consequence. No one pries into your destiny without facing the weight of their intrusion. No one manipulates what was never meant to be controlled. Your presence does not need to seek retribution. The universe already handles that for you. This is not arrogance. This is not pride. This is law. This is balance. This is the order of the unseen, enforced, unwavering, and absolute.